At my sister's wedding, her father-in-law toasted, "To a man with a real job, unlike his brother in the army." I stood up and handed him my retirement orders. I arrived at my sister Tessa's wedding with my retirement papers tucked inside my jacket pocket. 22 years in the military, and this was my final mission, being there for my little sister on her big day. The venue was beautiful, all white flowers and twinkling lights. Mom intercepted me at the entrance, pulling me aside with that worried look I knew too well. She squeezed my arm gently. "Marcus, I need to warn you about Victor." "Caleb's father?" I asked. "He's difficult, very opinionated about what constitutes a real career." Her eyes darted across the room to where a tall, well-dressed man stood holding court among several guests. I nodded, understanding immediately. "Got it, I'll keep my distance." Tessa spotted me from across the room and rushed over, her wedding dress floating around her like a cloud. She hugged me tightly. "You made it! I wasn't sure if you'd get leave in time." "Wouldn't miss it for anything," I told her. She introduced me to Caleb and his brother Wesley. Both seemed nervous, exchanging glances when Tessa mentioned my military service. I noticed Caleb's firm handshake and genuine smile despite the awkwardness. The ceremony began shortly after. I sat next to Mom in the front row, watching my sister beam with happiness. Victor, seated across the aisle, made several pointed comments about steady careers and real contributions just loud enough for me to hear. I ignored him, focusing instead on Tessa's joy. This was her day, not a time for confrontation. After the ceremony, I was surprised to see Desmond, my former commanding officer, among the guests. He approached me with a warm smile. "Couldn't miss seeing you off to civilian life, Colonel." We were catching up when Leanna, Tessa's maid of honor, appeared at my side. She leaned in close. "Just a heads up, Victor's been making comments all day about military careers being for people who couldn't hack it in the real world." "Thanks for the warning," I said. "I'm used to it." During cocktail hour, Victor's voice carried across the terrace. "Real careers build something lasting, not just following orders and playing soldier." He wasn't looking at me, but the message was clear. Caleb approached me moments later, his face flushed with embarrassment. "I'm sorry about my father. He doesn't understand what you do." "Don't worry about it," I assured him. "This is about you and Tessa, not me." My father Connor stood nearby, proudly telling another guest about my service record. 22 years serving his country. That's my son. I noticed Tessa's anxious glances toward Victor's family throughout the evening. She seemed tense whenever they were nearby, her smile becoming forced. I considered leaving early to prevent any drama, but I couldn't do that to her. The wedding planner, Kendra, announced dinner would begin soon. "We'll start with toasts right after everyone's seated," she said, directing guests toward the ballroom. I took my place at the head table, feeling the weight of my retirement papers in my jacket. They represented everything I'd accomplished, everything Victor seemed to dismiss. Corinne, my ex-wife, stopped by my chair before taking her seat. "I'm proud of you, Marcus," she said quietly. "Always have been." Before I could respond, the sound of metal against glass cut through the chatter. Victor stood, champagne flute in hand, ready to make the first toast of the evening. His eyes met mine briefly, a smug smile playing at the corners of his mouth. The room quieted as he prepared to speak. Victor stood with his champagne glass raised, commanding everyone's attention. His smile was all teeth, and no warmth. The entire ballroom fell silent as he began his toast. "Today, my son Caleb has proven what I've always known. He's a man who makes the right choices," Victor announced. "He chose a prestigious college, a respectable career in finance, and now, a beautiful bride." Tessa gripped Caleb's hand tightly under the table. Her smile looked frozen in place. Victor continued, his voice carrying across the room with practiced authority. "Some young men waste their prime years chasing adventure or following orders," he said. "Not my Caleb. He built something real, something that matters." I felt the room's attention shift toward me. Victor wasn't even trying to be subtle anymore. Patrice touched her husband's arm gently. "Victor, perhaps we should focus on the happy couple," she suggested quietly. He ignored her completely. "My son earns 6 figures helping businesses grow, not destroying things in foreign countries," Victor continued. "He'll provide Tessa with stability and a real future." Micah, Victor's business partner, chuckled from the next table. This encouraged Victor further. He raised his glass higher. "I'm proud that my son chose a real career instead of playing soldier for 2 decades, he said, looking directly at me now. "To Caleb, a man with a real job." The silence that followed was absolute. Not a single guest raised their glass. I saw the color drain from Tessa's face. This wasn't just embarrassment, it was fear. "Dad, that's enough," Caleb said, standing quickly. "You're being incredibly disrespectful to Marcus." My mother appeared at my side like she'd materialized from thin air. She placed her hand on my shoulder and whispered, "Let it go, Marcus, for Tessa's sake." Caleb was frantically apologizing to everyone. "I'm so sorry. My father doesn't speak for me, or my feelings about military service." Wesley stood up and reached for the microphone. "I think that's enough toasting for now, Dad." Victor pulled the microphone away from his son's grasp. "I'm not finished." Kendra, the wedding planner, rushed to the front of the room. "Let's move on to the cake cutting, shall we?" Her voice was high and strained. I noticed how coordinated their response was. Caleb, Wesley, Patrice, and Kendra all working together to contain Victor. This clearly wasn't the first time they'd managed his behavior. The guests were watching me now. I felt their eyes, waiting to see if the military man would explode. I caught Desmond's gaze across the room. He gave me a slight nod, the same one he'd given before difficult missions. I looked at Tessa, who seemed torn between fury and tears. Caleb was still apologizing, his face flushed with shame. Patrice was tugging at Victor's jacket sleeve, trying to get him to sit down. Victor remained standing, his expression smug and challenging. He thought he'd won something. He thought I would either cause a scene or slink away defeated. I felt the weight of my retirement papers in my jacket pocket. 22 years of service, 3 months of carrying these orders, waiting for the right moment to begin my civilian life. The ballroom remained frozen in that terrible silence. Victor raised his glass again, clearly enjoying being the center of attention. To real careers and real contributions to society. Liana caught my eye from the head table. She looked ready to tackle Victor herself if I didn't respond. Mallory was whispering frantically to the other bridesmaids, all of them watching me with concern. Seth the photographer had his camera raised, capturing this moment of family drama for posterity. I wondered what headline he was imagining for this shot. I took a deep breath and straightened my shoulders. The decision was made. I stood up slowly, methodically straightening my jacket with the precision that had become second nature after 2 decades of military discipline. Every eye in the room followed me as I began to move. I stood up and methodically straightened my jacket. The ballroom remained completely silent as I walked toward Victor's table. Every eye in the room followed my movement, watching to see what the military man would do next. Liana leaned over to Mallory at the head table. I've never seen Marcus look like that before. Victor has no idea who he just insulted. I reached inside my jacket pocket and removed the folded retirement orders I'd been carrying for 3 months. The papers felt heavy in my hand, weighted with 22 years of service and sacrifice. I approached Victor's table without rushing. My footsteps echoed in the silent room. I placed the documents directly in front of him without saying a word. Victor looked up at me with that same smug expression. He unfolded the papers with theatrical slowness, clearly expecting something trivial. His eyes scanned the first few lines. The smugness vanished from his face. The color drained away as he registered the classified letterhead and official military seals. His hands began to tremble slightly. Colonel Marcus Wade, Victor read aloud, his voice suddenly unsteady. Delta Force. A murmur swept through the ballroom. Guests exchanged shocked glances. Tessa's mouth fell open in surprise. Victor continued reading, his voice growing quieter with each line. Joint Special Operations Command. Operation Gothic Serpent. Silver Star recipient. Bronze Star with Valor. I stood perfectly still as Victor absorbed the information. His hands were visibly shaking now. He looked up at me with new eyes, suddenly understanding exactly who he'd been insulting. These are classified counter-terrorism operations, he said, his voice barely audible. Tessa stared at me from the head table. She had never known the details of my service. I had never told her. The look of shock on her face was mixed with something else. Pride. Seth captured the moment perfectly with his camera, the flash briefly illuminating Victor's stunned expression. That photo would become a family treasure. Victor slowly rose to his feet. His previous confidence had evaporated completely. He raised his glass with a trembling hand. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, his voice cracking slightly, I'd like to correct my previous toast. To Colonel Marcus Wade, a true American hero. The guests raised their glasses. Many stood in respect. I leaned in close to Victor, close enough that only he could hear my next words. For the record, I said quietly, I wasn't following orders, I was giving them. Victor nodded once, understanding washing over his face. He finally realized the magnitude of his mistake. He had spent the evening belittling a decorated Delta Force colonel to make himself feel important. I turned and walked back to my seat, leaving my retirement papers on the table in front of Victor. The documents that had marked the end of one chapter of my life had just opened another. Desmond caught my eye from across the room and gave me a slight nod of approval. My father, Connor, stood tall, his face beaming with unmistakable pride. Tessa reached for my hand as I returned to the head table. Why didn't you ever tell me? She whispered. It wasn't something I could talk about, I replied simply. The silence in the room had transformed. It was no longer tense and awkward. It was respectful, almost reverent. Victor remained standing, looking completely lost for words. Patrice placed her hand on her husband's arm, gently guiding him back to his seat. The look she gave me was full of apology and newfound respect. Caleb stood up and raised his glass. To my brother-in-law, Colonel Marcus Wade, thank you for your service. The entire room echoed his words, thank you for your service. I nodded once in acknowledgement. I hadn't wanted this attention or recognition. I'd spent my career in the shadows by choice, but Victor had forced my hand. Kendra approached the head table, clearly relieved that the tension had been diffused. Shall we proceed with the cake cutting now? She asked. Tessa squeezed my hand one more time before standing to join her new husband. The celebration continued, but something fundamental had changed in the room. I watched as Victor sat in stunned silence, still staring at my retirement papers. He now understood exactly who he had been trying to humiliate. The man who had spent 22 years protecting people like him, whether they appreciated it or not. The applause started with one person and swept through the entire ballroom like a wave. Guests rose to their feet in a standing ovation. The atmosphere had completely transformed from tense silence to overwhelming respect. Desmond approached me and rendered a perfect military salute. Colonel Wade, it's been an honor serving with you. I returned his salute crisply. The honor was mine, Commander. Victor made his way to me after the applause died down. He looked like a completely different man, humbled and uncomfortable. Colonel, I'd like to apologize for my behavior. I accept your apology, I told him. On one condition. Anything, he said quickly. Never speak about military service that way again. Not to me, not to anyone. My tone left no room for negotiation. Victor nodded. You have my word. Tessa broke away from the head table and wrapped her arms around me. I had no idea, she whispered. Thank you for showing restraint. Anyone else would have caused a scene. I hugged her back. It's your day. That's all that matters. Caleb approached next, his face still flushed with embarrassment. Marcus, I'm so sorry about my father. I promise I'll handle him from now on. Your father made his own choices, I said. You're not responsible for his actions. Patrice found me near the cake table a few minutes later. She looked genuinely distressed. Colonel Wade, I'm ashamed of Victor's behavior. Please know his views aren't shared by the rest of us. I appreciate that, I said simply. My father, Connor, spent the next hour proudly introducing me to everyone he could find. This is my son, Colonel Marcus Wade. The pride in his voice was unmistakable. Kendra managed to get the reception back on track. Ladies and gentlemen, the bride and groom will now cut their cake. The celebration continued with renewed energy. The tension had evaporated completely. Mallory cornered me by the dessert table with a curious expression. So what happens now? She asked. After the military, I mean. I'm starting a veteran support program, I explained, helping soldiers transition to civilian life. That's amazing, she said. The world needs more people like you. I noticed Micah deliberately avoiding me for the rest of the night. He took the long way around tables whenever I was nearby. His earlier laughter at Victor's comments had clearly come back to haunt him. Corinne approached me during the final hour of the reception. I always knew you'd succeed, Marcus. You were always destined for greatness. Thank you, I said. That means a lot. The DJ asked me to say a few words before the final dance. I hadn't planned to speak, but the room quieted as I took the microphone. I spent 22 years serving alongside the finest men and women this country has to offer. I said, I found purpose in service. Now I'm starting a new chapter, but that purpose remains the same, to serve others. Tessa and Caleb left the reception amid a shower of rose petals. They looked happy together, despite the family drama. Something fundamental had shifted in their family dynamic tonight. I watched them drive away, feeling strangely peaceful. My military career was officially over. The retirement papers that had exposed Victor's ignorance had also freed me to embrace civilian life. Mom squeezed my arm as we watched the car disappear down the driveway. You handled that perfectly. I learned from the best, I told her. Victor stood alone at the edge of the crowd, looking thoughtful and subdued. His education had been expensive but effective. He now understood the true meaning of service and sacrifice. I collected my retirement papers from the table where I'd left them. These documents had closed one chapter of my life and opened another. 22 years of service had prepared me for whatever came next. The night air was cool and clear as I walked to my car. For the first time in decades, I had no mission, no orders, no deployment looming ahead. I was simply Marcus Wade, civilian. And I was ready for whatever came next.